Hello, if you like exciting love stories, be sure to click on the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one.
The Smiths' anniversary party was in full swing. A cascade of warm lights illuminated the backyard as a jazz quartet played smooth tunes that mingled with the chatter of the couple's closest friends and family. Dan Smith, 45, a reserved yet well-regarded architect, surveyed the scene with a faint smile. He stood by the drink table, holding a glass of scotch, watching his wife, Lena, glide through the crowd. Lena, at 42, was radiant. Her figure-hugging dress shimmered under the glow of the overhead lights, and her laugh rang clear and melodious as she entertained their guests. To everyone present, she seemed the epitome of grace and joy, the perfect hostess. But Dan had noticed the subtle shifts in her demeanor over the past few weeks. Her attentiveness had waned, her late-night texts and secretive calls had grown more frequent, and her laughter had taken on a nervous edge. Tonight, it all seemed heightened, and the sense of unease that had been gnawing at him for weeks now felt unavoidable. A glimpse behind the curtain as the evening wore on, Dan's suspicions began to crystallize. He caught Lena standing near the far end of the garden, speaking with a tall, sharp-dressed man who didn't look like any of their usual acquaintances. They stood close, the man leaning in slightly as Lena smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dan felt the first pang of betrayal bloom in his chest. Keeping his movements casual, he edged closer, pretending to refill his glass while straining to catch snippets of their conversation. "Have to be careful tonight," Lena murmured. The man replied, his tone low and assured. "Relax. Nobody suspects anything." Dan froze, the scotch bottle slipping slightly in his hand. He set it down hastily, glancing over his shoulder as the two parted ways. Lena disappeared into the house, while the man returned to mingling with the guests, his expression calm, almost smug. A warning ignored Dan's pulse quickened as he followed Lena inside. He found her in the kitchen, standing by the counter, her phone in hand. Her smile vanished the moment she saw him. "What are you doing in here?" Lena asked, her tone defensive. "Getting a refill," Dan said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "You looked like you needed a moment. Everything okay?" Lena forced a laugh. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Dan hesitated, then decided to push a little further. "That guy you were talking to outside. Who is he?" Lena's eyes flickered, betraying a brief moment of panic before she composed herself. "Oh, that's Jonathan, a friend from work. He wanted advice about something." Dan nodded slowly, though her answer only deepened his suspicions. "Funny. I don't recall you mentioning a Jonathan before." "It's nothing, Dan," Lena said firmly, brushing past him to return to the party. Finding the note unable to shake his growing doubt, Dan decided to stay behind in the kitchen. His eyes swept over the room, landing on Lena's purse, which sat slightly ajar on the counter. He wrestled with himself for a moment before reaching for it, telling himself it was only to find clarity. Inside, he found her phone, a lipstick, and a folded piece of paper with the edges hastily torn. Curiosity burned through him as he unfolded the note. "Tonight's the night. Leave quietly at 10 p.m. Everything's ready." Dan's chest tightened as he reread the message. Who had written it? And what exactly was ready? Confrontation deferred. Lena re-entered the kitchen abruptly, catching Dan off guard. He stuffed the note into his pocket and turned to her with forced nonchalance. "You're still here?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Just finished my drink," Dan replied, lifting his glass. "Wanted to make sure you weren't overworking yourself." Lena gave him a tight smile. "Don't worry about me." As she left, Dan gripped the edge of the counter, his mind racing. He couldn't confront her yet, not without knowing more. Whatever was happening tonight, he needed to find out. The clock strikes 10 as the evening wound down. Dan kept an eye on the clock. At exactly 10 p.m., he noticed Lena slipping away from the remaining guests, heading toward the house. He followed at a distance, staying hidden in the shadows. She grabbed her coat and purse, then hesitated, glancing toward the door before stepping outside. Dan's heart pounded as he trailed her into the night, keeping a safe distance. The sound of an engine reached his ears, and he saw the sharp-dressed man from earlier leaning casually against a sleek black car. Lena approached him, and the man opened the passenger door with a flourish. Dan's blood ran cold as Lena climbed inside without hesitation. What comes next? Dan stood frozen in place as the car drove away, his mind a whirlwind of rage and disbelief. The note, the secrecy, the man. It all pointed to something he didn't want to admit. But as much as the betrayal stung, Dan's shock gave way to determination. He wasn't the kind of man to sit idly by while his world fell apart. If Lena thought she could leave him in the dark, she was sorely mistaken. Dan turned on his heel, a plan forming in his mind. Whatever was waiting at the end of this night, he would uncover the truth, and he wasn't going to do it quietly. The night felt colder than usual as Dan drove through the city, his mind racing. He had followed the black car for miles, careful to keep a safe distance. The taillights glowed like embers in the dark, leading him through unfamiliar streets. Lena had always been the one to plan their routes, the one who knew every shortcut and scenic detour. But tonight, her destination was a mystery, and Dan was determined to uncover it. The arrival of the car finally pulled into the driveway of a modest but well-kept suburban home. Dan parked down the street, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He watched as Lena stepped out, her posture tense yet purposeful. The sharp-dressed man exited from the driver's side, walking around to open the front door for her. They disappeared inside, the door closing with an almost deliberate finality. Dan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Questions buzzed in his mind like relentless gnats. Who was this man? What was he offering Lena that she didn't already have at home? And what was she willing to risk for it? After a moment's hesitation, Dan stepped out of the car. His breath formed small clouds in the cool night air as he approached the house. A closer look, Dan positioned himself near a side window, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see Lena and the man sitting in the living room. A bottle of wine rested on the coffee table between them, and Lena held a glass in her hand, her expression contemplative. The man leaned forward, speaking animatedly, his hands gesturing as if he were making a case. Lena nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips, a smile Dan hadn't seen in months. The sight sent a jolt of anger through him. He wanted to storm in, demand answers, and end this farce. But he forced himself to stay put. If he was going to confront Lena, he needed to know the full story. Pieces of the puzzle as Dan watched. Lena handed the man an envelope. He opened it, glanced at the contents, and then gave her a reassuring nod. They stood, and the man placed a hand on Lena's back, guiding her toward another room. Dan clenched his fists, the scene confirming what he had feared. But as the door closed behind them, he noticed something odd, a corkboard on the far wall of the living room, partially obscured by a bookshelf. Curiosity overpowered his anger. Dan crept closer, peering through the window to get a better look. The corkboard was covered with documents, maps, and photographs. His eyes scanned the images, and his breath caught in his throat when he spotted one of himself. The discovery Dan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Why was his photo on that board? And what were the other papers? Bank statements, property records, handwritten notes. The pieces didn't add up. This wasn't the setup of a romantic tryst. It looked more like an investigation. His phone vibrated in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. Leave now if you value your safety. Dan's blood ran cold. He looked around, scanning the street and nearby houses, but saw no one. The text had confirmed one thing, though. He wasn't just dealing with a man stealing his wife. This was something far more dangerous. Unraveling the lie back in his car, Dan drove aimlessly for a while, his mind a storm of confusion and anger. He didn't want to believe Lena was involved in something criminal, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. He parked near a diner, the neon sign flickering above him as he stared blankly out the windshield. Pulling out his phone, he began piecing together the fragments of the night. The note he had found in Lena's purse, the photos and documents on the corkboard, the mysterious text warning him to leave. Each piece hinted at a larger conspiracy, one he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover but couldn't ignore. Seeking help the next morning, Dan called his friend Greg, a former police detective turned private investigator. Greg had always been good at sniffing out the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Dan, this doesn't sound like your typical affair, Greg said after Dan recounted the events. This guy might not just be stealing your wife. He could be manipulating her for something bigger. Like what? Dan asked, his frustration mounting. I don't know yet, Greg admitted. But if you want answers, we'll have to dig deeper. Can you get me into that house? Dan hesitated, the memory of the text flashing in his mind. It's risky. Risky is my job, Greg said firmly. If you want to protect Lena and yourself, you need to let me help. Into the shadows that evening, Dan and Greg returned to the house under the cover of darkness. Greg, dressed in all black, carried a small toolkit and a handheld camera. You wait here, Greg instructed. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, call the cops. Dan nodded, his stomach twisting with anxiety as Greg disappeared into the shadows. Minutes ticked by like hours. Dan's mind conjured worst-case scenarios. Lena and the man catching Greg, a confrontation turning violent, or Greg uncovering something too horrifying to face. When Greg finally returned, his expression was grim. What did you find? Dan asked urgently. Greg handed him the camera, his tone serious. You're not going to like this. The truth begins to unfold. Dan scrolled through the photos Greg had taken inside the house. They showed the corkboard in detail, maps of financial institutions, dossiers on high-profile individuals, and a detailed timeline of events. At the center of it all was Dan's photo, connected by strings to various documents. One line led to a bank account in his name, an account Dan had never opened. This isn't just about Lena, Greg said. Whoever this guy is, he's setting you up for something big. Fraud, maybe worse. Dan's stomach churned as the pieces began to fit together. His wife's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was part of a larger scheme. And what he did next would change everything. The weight of Greg's discovery crushed Dan like a landslide. The evidence inside the house painted a picture of a man poised to destroy his life. Not just his marriage, but his reputation, his career, and everything he had built. And Lena was right in the middle of it. Dan paced his living room, the photos Greg had printed from the camera spread across the coffee table. Each image was a puzzle piece, and together they revealed a plot far more sinister than he could have imagined. The fraudulent bank account in his name was tied to transactions worth millions, money that Dan had never seen. They're setting you up to take the fall, Greg said grimly, sipping from a mug of coffee as they pored over the evidence. If this goes through, you'll be left holding the bag for fraud or embezzlement. And with that account in your name, good luck proving you didn't do it. Dan clenched his fists, his anger burning away the fear. Not a chance. I'm not going to let them get away with this. A calculated confrontation the next evening, Dan made a decision. He would confront Lena, not with rage, but with precision. She needed to know he wasn't blind to her betrayal, and he needed to know just how deep she was in. Lena arrived home late, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Dan sat at the dining table, the corkboard photos fanned out in front of him like playing cards. You're home early, Lena said, her tone casual. But when she saw the evidence on the table, her expression froze. What's this? She asked, feigning ignorance. Dan's eyes were cold as he gestured to the photos. I could ask you the same thing, Lena. Care to explain why my face is on a corkboard next to a fraudulent bank account? Lena's mouth opened, but no words came out. She glanced at the photos, then back at Dan, her mask of composure beginning to crack. I don't know what you're talking about, she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. Dan slammed his hand on the table, making her flinch. Don't lie to me, Lena. I followed you. I saw you with him. And I know what you're planning. The truth comes out for a moment. Lena's shoulders slumped, and she seemed on the verge of breaking down. But then she straightened, her eyes narrowing with defiance. You don't understand, she said, her voice sharp. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me, Dan demanded. Lena hesitated, then sighed heavily. Jonathan isn't some lover, Dan. He's my partner. We've been working together on this for months. Working on what? Dan pressed. Taking down corruption, Lena said, her tone defensive. The account in your name, it's bait. A way to draw out the real criminals behind this operation. Dan stared at her, incredulous. You expect me to believe you're some kind of undercover whistleblower? It's the truth, Lena insisted. Jonathan works for a private intelligence firm. He recruited me because of my connections to your work. You've dealt with powerful people, Dan. People who've hidden their crimes behind layers of bureaucracy. We're trying to expose them. Trust shattered. Dan's mind reeled. Was she lying again? Or was this some convoluted truth? If that's true, Dan said slowly, why didn't you tell me? Why keep me in the dark and make me think you were cheating? Because I had to, Lena said, her voice rising. You're too honest, Dan. You wouldn't have gone along with it. You'd have blown the whole operation before we had enough evidence. Dan's anger flared. So you used me? You risked our marriage, my career, my freedom. All for some crusade I never asked to be part of? It's not like that, Lena said, her tone softening. I did it for us. To make the world better, for us, for everyone. Don't you dare justify this as noble, Dan shot back. You didn't just betray me. You made me a target. A shocking turn before Lena could respond. Dan's phone buzzed. It was a text from Greg. They know we've been in the house. Be careful. Dan felt a chill run down his spine. Who else is involved in this, Lena? Who's coming after us now? Lena's eyes widened, her defiance melting into fear. Jonathan said we were safe. That no one would suspect us yet. Yet? Dan echoed, his voice dripping with disbelief. Do you even hear yourself? A knock at the door interrupted their argument, the sound heavy and deliberate. Were you expecting anyone? Dan asked, his voice low. Lena shook her head, her face pale. The stranger arrives. Dan moved cautiously toward the door, glancing through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood on the porch, his expression impassive. Who is it? Lena whispered. I don't know, Dan muttered, his hand hesitating over the doorknob. Open it, the man called out, his voice calm but authoritative. We need to talk. Dan opened the door slightly, keeping the chain in place. Who are you? The man held up a badge. Agent Harris, Department of Homeland Security. We're here about Jonathan Rains. Lena gasped, and Dan's blood ran cold. We need you both to come with us, Harris continued. There's a lot you don't know, and not much time to explain. A choice to make. Dan turned to Lena, his anger warring with a rising sense of dread. What did you get us into? Lena looked at him, her eyes pleading. I didn't know it would go this far. But if they're here, it means Jonathan wasn't honest with me either. Dan clenched his jaw, his trust in Lena shattered, but his survival instincts kicking in. He looked back at Harris. If I go with you, Dan said, his voice steady, it's only to protect my name. And if I find out you're lying, you'll regret it. Harris nodded. Fair enough. But you're going to want to hear what we have to say. As Dan and Lena stepped out into the night, the weight of their choices pressed down on them. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was clear. Their lives would never be the same. The ride in the unmarked black SUV was suffocating. Dan sat stiffly, his hands gripping his knees while Lena stared out the window, her face pale and unreadable. Agent Harris sat across from them, his demeanor unreadable, as though he were weighing how much to reveal. When the vehicle finally came to a halt, they were escorted into a nondescript government building, its interior sterile and devoid of character. Harris led them to a small, windowless conference room and gestured for them to sit. You're probably wondering why you're here, Harris began, his tone calm but firm. What you've stumbled into is much bigger than either of you realized. Dan leaned forward, his anger barely contained. Let's cut the theatrics. Tell me what this is really about. Unveiling the plan, Harris slid a file across the table, the word classified, stamped in bold red letters. Inside were photographs, financial statements, and reports that made Dan's stomach churn. Jonathan Rains is a con artist and a high-level operative for a shadow organization, Harris explained. He recruits people like your wife, those with access to high-profile individuals or sensitive information, and uses them to set up financial scams. Dan glared at Lena. So she was helping him frame me? No, Harris said quickly, glancing at Lena. At least, not knowingly. Rains is a master manipulator. He likely fed her a story about exposing corruption to get her cooperation. In reality, he was using her to gain access to your finances and your network. Lena's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I thought I was helping uncover something important. Harris leaned back, his expression grim. That's how he operates, making his targets believe they're part of something bigger, something noble. But once he's done with them, he leaves them to take the fall. Dan stood abruptly, pacing the room as anger surged through him. So, let me get this straight. My wife was so gullible that she handed this guy everything he needed to ruin my life and hers. Lena flinched at his words. I didn't know he was lying, Dan. I thought I was doing something meaningful. Meaningful? Dan barked, his voice rising. You handed over our lives to a criminal. Do you even understand what could have happened if I hadn't found out? Harris raised a hand. Focus, both of you. The important thing now is stopping Rains before he disappears. And we need your help to do it. A dangerous proposition, Dan scoffed, crossing his arms. Why should I help you? So you can clean up my wife's mess? Because if we don't stop Rains, you'll still be implicated, Harris said bluntly. He's already set up the framework to tie you to the fraudulent account. If he gets away, you'll be left holding the bag. And we both know the justice system doesn't always get it right. Lena looked at Dan, her eyes pleading. Please, Dan, we can fix this. Together. Dan met her gaze, his expression cold. You don't get to say together after what you've done. Harris cleared his throat, redirecting the conversation. Here's the deal. We need you to help lure Rains out of hiding. He's expecting a follow-up meeting with Lena in 2 days. If we can intercept him there, we can arrest him before he has a chance to disappear. Dan hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He despised the idea of working with Lena after her betrayal, but the thought of losing everything he'd built was even worse. Fine, he said finally, but I'm not doing this for her. I'm doing it to protect myself. The setup the next 2 days were a whirlwind of preparation. Harris and his team coached Lena on how to act during the meeting, emphasizing the need to keep Rains unaware of their involvement. Dan, meanwhile, was fitted with a wire and given a crash course in surveillance. On the day of the operation, they arrived at a high-end hotel where the meeting was set to take place. Lena sat at the bar, nervously sipping a glass of wine, while Dan and the agents monitored from a van parked nearby. He's here, Lena whispered into the small microphone hidden in her necklace as Rains approached. Dan watched the screen intently, his stomach twisting as Rains greeted Lena with a charming smile. The Trap Titans Rains led Lena to a private lounge, where their conversation turned quickly to business. Did you bring the documents? Rains asked, his tone casual but commanding. Yes, Lena said, sliding a folder across the table. Everything you need is in there. Rains opened the folder, scanning its contents. His smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of suspicion. These aren't the originals, he said, his eyes narrowing. Lena's voice wavered. I thought you just needed copies. Dan tensed in the van, watching as Rains's demeanor shifted. He leaned closer to Lena, his voice low but menacing. Are you trying to play me? The sting before Lena could respond. Harris's voice crackled over the radio. We're moving in. Stay put. Moments later, a team of agents burst into the lounge, their weapons drawn. Rains bolted, shoving Lena aside as he made for the exit. Dan jumped from the van, joining the chase as the agents pursued Rains through the hotel's winding halls. Dan rounded a corner just in time to see Rains being tackled to the ground by Harris. The conman struggled briefly before being restrained, his face a mask of fury. It's over, Rains, Harris said, hauling him to his feet. A fractured resolution back at the government building. Harris thanked Dan and Lena for their cooperation. "We'll handle the fallout from here," he said. "You've done your part." As they walked to the parking lot, Dan turned to Lena, his expression unreadable. "This doesn't change anything," he said. "You broke something between us, Lena, and I don't know if it can be fixed." Lena's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I understand. I just hope you'll find it in your heart to forgive me someday." Dan didn't respond. He got into his car and drove away, leaving Lena standing alone in the cold night air. The days following the operation blurred into a haze for Dan. The arrest of Jonathan Rains had made headlines, though Dan's involvement had been carefully omitted from the story to protect his privacy. The fraudulent account was dismantled, and with Rains in custody, the immediate threat to Dan's reputation and career had subsided. But the scars of betrayal lingered, raw and unyielding. Dan spent his days throwing himself into work, avoiding the questions and sympathetic glances from colleagues who suspected something was amiss. At night, he returned to an empty house that felt more like a museum of a life he no longer recognized. A message from Lena one evening. Dan's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Lena. "I know I've lost your trust, but I need to talk to you. Please." Dan stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Tomorrow. Coffee shop on Main. Noon." The next day, Dan arrived early, taking a seat by the window where he could watch the bustling street outside. When Lena walked in, she looked tired, her usual polish dulled by the weight of recent events. "Thank you for meeting me," she said softly, sitting across from him. Dan nodded but remained silent, waiting for her to speak. An attempt at reconciliation. "I've been replaying everything in my head," Lena began, her voice trembling. "What I did, how I lied to you. I can't forgive myself for it. But I need you to know, I never wanted to hurt you." Dan's jaw tightened. "Hurt me? Lena, you didn't just hurt me. You endangered everything we built together. And for what? To chase some fantasy about saving the world?" Lena's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't a fantasy, Dan. I thought I was doing something good, something meaningful. But I see now how wrong I was." Dan shook his head, his voice cold. "You see now? What about when you were sneaking around, handing over information to a man who was using you and me? Did you see it then?" Lena reached across the table, her hand hovering near his. "Please, Dan. I know I made mistakes, but I want to make things right. I want to rebuild what we had." Dan pulled back, his expression unreadable. "Rebuild? There's nothing left to rebuild, Lena. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and you destroyed that the moment you chose Rains over me." A painful goodbye. Lena's shoulders slumped, her tears falling freely now. "So that's it? 15 years, and it's just over?" Dan looked away, his throat tightening. 15 years doesn't disappear overnight. But what you did, it's not something I can forget or forgive. Lena nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "I understand." She stood, hesitating for a moment, as if waiting for Dan to stop her. When he didn't, she walked out of the cafe, leaving him alone with his thoughts. A chance encounter. A week later, while walking through the park near his office, Dan saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench. Greg, his old friend and the private investigator who had helped him uncover Rains's scheme, was enjoying a coffee. Dan approached, and Greg greeted him with a smile. "You look like a man with a lot on his mind." Dan sat beside him, sighing heavily. "You could say that." Greg took a sip of his coffee. "I heard about the fallout with Lena. Tough break." "Yeah," Dan said, staring at the ducks gliding across the pond. "I don't even know where to go from here." Greg nodded thoughtfully. "It's not about where you go, Dan. It's about who you become. What happened with Lena, it doesn't define you. But how you choose to move forward does." A new beginning. Greg's words lingered with Dan in the days that followed. He began to focus on himself, rediscovering hobbies and passions he had set aside over the years. He joined a cycling group, started cooking again, and even took a woodworking class. One evening, while browsing a local bookstore, Dan struck up a conversation with a woman in the history section. Her name was Claire, and she was a historian with a quick wit and a warm smile. Their conversation flowed easily, and by the end of the night, they had exchanged numbers. Reflecting on the journey months later, Dan found himself in a much different place. His home was no longer a reminder of betrayal, but a sanctuary he had rebuilt with care. His days were filled with purpose, and his evenings often included time spent with Claire, whose presence brought a lightness he hadn't felt in years. One night, as they shared a quiet dinner, Claire asked, "Do you ever think about the past? About what you've been through?" Dan smiled, his gaze steady. "I think about it, but I don't live in it. What happened with Lena taught me a lot. About trust, resilience, and knowing when to let go. It wasn't easy, but it led me here. And I wouldn't trade this for anything." A life reclaimed. Dan's journey wasn't one of vengeance or bitterness, but of growth and renewal. He had faced betrayal, loss, and uncertainty, but he emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the possibilities of a new chapter. As he sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset with Claire beside him, Dan felt a profound sense of peace. The road he had traveled was painful, but it had brought him to a place of hope, and that was more than enough. The months following Dan's separation from Lena had brought clarity and renewal. His connection with Claire was growing deeper, but a lingering sense of unfinished business gnawed at him. No matter how much he tried to move forward, the specter of Jonathan Raines's betrayal and Lena's role in it remained in the back of his mind. One rainy afternoon, as Dan returned from the bookstore with Claire, his phone buzzed with a call from Greg. "Hey, Dan," Greg said, his tone serious. "You might want to sit down for this." Dan's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "It's about Raines," Greg said. "There's been a development." Turns out, his operation was just the tip of the iceberg. A shocking revelation. Greg explained that new evidence had surfaced, linking Raines to an international network of financial crimes that spanned decades. What was more shocking, however, was that Lena's name had appeared on a recently uncovered list of operatives. "Are you saying she was working with him from the beginning?" Dan asked, his voice tense. Greg hesitated. "Not exactly. It looks like Raines manipulated her into joining, but she eventually knew more than she let on. And she stayed involved long after she should have walked away." Dan felt his chest tighten. "Why didn't she tell me?" "Maybe she thought she was protecting you," Greg said. "Or maybe she was in too deep to stop." A visit from Lena later that evening. As Dan was clearing his workbench in the garage, his doorbell rang. He opened it to find Lena standing there, her face pale and drawn. "Dan," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." Dan hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the tension between them palpable. "I heard about Raines," Dan said, breaking the silence. "And about you." Lena's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want you to find out this way." "So it's true?" Dan asked, his voice cold. "You were deeper into this than you admitted?" Lena nodded, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "Yes. At first, I thought I was doing the right thing. But as time went on, I realized I was trapped. Raines had dirt on me, things he threatened to use if I tried to leave. I didn't know how to get out." A confession. Lena explained how Raines had gradually pulled her into his schemes, using her access to Dan's connections as leverage. When she tried to cut ties, Raines blackmailed her with fabricated evidence that made it appear she had willingly participated in the fraud. "I didn't know who to turn to," Lena said, her voice breaking. "I was terrified, Dan. I thought if I told you, I'd drag you down with me." Dan's anger simmered beneath the surface. "So instead, you dragged me into it without telling me? You let me believe this was all about exposing corruption, when the real corruption was you and him?" Lena's tears fell freely now. "I made so many mistakes, but I swear, I never meant to hurt you. I was trying to protect you." Dan stood, pacing the room as he tried to process her words. "You didn't protect me, Lena. You betrayed me. And you betrayed yourself." An ultimatum. Lena looked up at him, her expression desperate. "I need your help, Dan. Raines's network is still out there, and they're coming after everyone he worked with. If you help me, We can finally put an end to this. Dan stopped, turning to face her. You want me to help you? After everything you've done? Please, Lena whispered. You're the only one I can trust. Dan hesitated, the weight of her request pressing down on him. Part of him wanted to slam the door on her and never look back. But another part, the part that had loved her for 15 years, couldn't ignore her plea for help. A dangerous alliance. Reluctantly, Dan agreed to meet with Greg to discuss the next steps. The three of them formulated a plan to expose the remaining members of Raines's network, using Lena's insider knowledge to their advantage. The operation was risky, involving coordinated efforts with Elle as they worked together. Dan and Lena's interactions were strained but professional. The shared goal of bringing down Raines's associates forced them to set aside their personal grievances, at least temporarily. The final showdown, the culmination of their efforts, came in the form of a sting operation at a luxury hotel, where one of Raines's top allies was set to meet with a potential buyer for stolen data. Lena posed as the intermediary, while Dan and Greg coordinated with law enforcement from a nearby suite. The tension in the air was electric as Lena entered the meeting room, her every move monitored through hidden cameras. Do you have the files? The buyer asked, his voice clipped. Yes, Lena said, sliding a briefcase across the table. But first, I need assurances. Before the buyer could respond, the room filled with armed agents, their commands echoing through the suite. The operation was over in minutes, the suspects taken into custody without incident. A final goodbye as the dust settled. Dan and Lena stood outside the hotel, the city lights casting a soft glow around them. This doesn't change anything between us, Dan said firmly. Lena nodded, her eyes glistening. I know, but I'm glad we did this. It's a small step toward making things right. Dan sighed, his anger tempered by exhaustion. I hope you find peace, Lena. For your sake. She smiled faintly, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. A life reclaimed. Weeks later, Dan sat on his porch with Claire, the events of the past year finally feeling like a closed chapter. You've been through so much, Claire said, her hand resting on his. How do you feel now? Dan looked out at the horizon, the sun setting in vibrant hues. Lighter, he said, and ready to keep moving forward. With Claire by his side, Dan knew he had found not just love, but a sense of stability and hope he hadn't felt in years.